That was a fail. Hey there, boils and ghouls, and happy Pride Month. For this month, I thought it would be fun to put together a list of my queer horror favorites. Couple of ground rules for making this list. First of all, how do we define queer? Well, I'm defining that by pretty much any movie, franchise, story, whatever, that includes at least one openly queer character. I am not counting it if there are no queer characters, but it deals with queer themes like something like Hellraiser.
Oh, no tears, please. It's a waste of good suffering.
Second rule, how do we define favorites? This is not going to be a list of the best horror movies that include queer themes. To make this list more interesting to me, I'm defining favorites as literally just that. It can either be a story, movie, franchise, whatever that I enjoy, or it can simply be one that I find very interesting to talk about. This is also good news for you, because that means that I'm gonna have a lot to say about all of these movies, stories, whatever here. We've got a whole unlucky 13 movies to get through here, so without further ado, let's get this started.
Hey, Angela. How come you never take showers when the rest of us do?
Number 13, Sleepaway Camp. It does feel a little odd to start the list with this one, considering how bad it is for representation. The first Sleepaway Camp movie came out in 1983, and I watched it for the first time when I was roughly 13 years old. The only thing I knew going into it was that it was an 80s slasher franchise that followed a female villain, and I was all for that. I was not at all prepared for the absolute insanity that is this movie, and I've been fascinated by it ever since. So our slasher villain is actually juxtaposed as the final girl for much of the movie, until the final moment when it's revealed in one fell swoop that Angela is both the killer and transgender. Her gender identity is explained with a backstory that involves an abusive aunt that forced her to wear dresses as a child. And so now she continues to identify as a girl and murder people who, honestly, just kind of deserve it. I'm just saying, we stan a queen who boils pedophiles alive. I have spoken about my thoughts on this choice in the past, but considering that video is now completely unwatchable, I'll go over them again briefly here. So first things first, this is obviously not how people become transgender. You can't just force a little boy into a dress and tell him that he's a girl. That's exactly what we do to trans kids all the time, and look how that turns out. Angela's home environment would have an effect on her self-esteem and mental health, but it wouldn't affect her gender identity. That's just ridiculous. It's very clear to me that the writers didn't understand transness. They were just using it as a simple device to get across two messages. One, trans people are all homicidal maniacs. And two, girls are just too soft and innocent to ever be capable of violence unless we explain it by giving them a penis. And I know what you're thinking. Maybe it's not as bad as I'm making it sound. To be fair, the movie does end rather abruptly after the big reveal that Angela is the killer. So maybe we can say that her journey is not supposed to reflect an actual trans woman, but rather the downfall of an abuse victim who started lashing out in the only way they knew how. Yeah, cool, until the sequel goes right ahead and confirms that Angela seeks out sex reassignment surgery while in custody.
The doctors gave him a sex change, and our parents' taxes paid for it.
And she even seems to blame her mental illness on her gender identity in one scene.
I did my time. 2 years of therapy, electroshock, plus every kind of pill you ever heard of, plus an operation. I'm completely cured.
This is just the most heteronormative, old-fashioned, misogynistic group of writers to ever come together and create a queer character. It's so weird. So why did this movie make this list? Because as I said before, this is a list of my queer horror favorites. Not the best queer representation of horror or the most well-made queer horror. And for all this movie's glaring faults, there is something oddly fascinating about it. To be perfectly honest, I think that this movie mostly just appeals to my literary critic brain that really can't resist exploring a story with a complicated context. I have seen this movie used to defend some pretty egregious beliefs, so I will never elevate it above the 13th spot. But that being said, as my own little case study, I can't deny that this franchise has struck a chord with me.
Everything's gonna be alright. You won't let them get away with this, that's for sure. I promise we won't.
People found it hard to believe that a babe like Jennifer would associate with a dork like me. Sandbox love never dies.
Number 12, Jennifer's Body. This movie came out when I was about 14, and I actually saw it in theaters with my best friend at the time. We're both queer now. I don't know what this movie did to us, but that's the story. So Jennifer's Body tells the story of best friends, Needy and Jennifer. They're sort of an odd pair, Needy being an introvert, and Jennifer being played by a 2009 Megan Fox, who's actually playing into her whole sexy image in a very self-aware way. I do have my problems with Megan Fox, namely the biphobic comments that she's made despite being a bisexual woman herself. It's just frustrating, you know? But regardless, she does bring something to this role that very few actresses could, dancing that fine line between dangerous and seductive, but also being very tragic and vulnerable. Megan Fox really was a better actress than people gave her credit for. I'm not trying to say that she was Shakespearean or anything, but when you're used to this...
Hey, that's pretty good stuff. I may have underestimated May's taste.
Come on, kids, follow the leader.
This...
Boo, cross out Needy.
Isn't that bad? The conflict enters into the movie when Jennifer starts to become a succubus after being sacrificed to the devil by an indie boy band in a scene that's clearly supposed to be a metaphor for sexual assault. Needy then tries to figure out what's going on with Jennifer. I have to admit though, I've always found it really weird the way that this movie represents queerness, because it's sort of just this weird mix between text and subtext. Like, other characters will call them out for being queer.
We're totally lesbian.
But they never claim to be, or never seriously anyway.
Thought you only murdered boys.
I go both ways.
Needy, on multiple occasions, appears to be attracted to Jennifer, and at one point they do kiss, but their friendship is never stated to be anything more than that. Friendship.
What? She's my best friend.
In fact, Needy spends the entire movie in a committed relationship with a man that she seems very happy with. That isn't to say that a woman can't be both queer and in a monogamous male-female relationship, it's just... what's going on here? Are we supposed to believe that Needy is bisexual? Because if so, then that's never made explicit, it's just hinted at.
A lot.
And to be honest, I've never really liked the ending to this movie. I feel like the heart of the movie should really just be the relationship between the two girls. And yet they turn on each other a bit too fast and a bit too hard for my liking.
Jennifer's evil.
I know.
No, I mean, she's actually evil. Not high school evil.
I would have appreciated something a little bit more like Ginger Snaps, which similarly ends with the two girls having to turn on each other, but always with this bittersweet understanding that they don't want to, they just have to. I never got the same sense of loss and regret from Jennifer's Body. If there is any emotion left over after Jennifer's dead, it's only anger. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm sounding really down about this movie, but it is actually pretty decent. This may not have been the best vehicle for exploring queerness, but it was a vehicle, and hey, that's something.
But we always share your bed when we have slumber parties.
Vill du bli ihop med mig? Oscar, jag är ingen flicka.
Number 11. Let the Right One In. Let the Right One In is one of those underrated horror stories that you only really hear people talk about in the right circles, and I think it's one of the best vampire stories to come out of recent years. The movie follows 12-year-old Oscar, a bullied little boy who has a hard time making friends until he meets 12-year-old Ellie, a vampire trapped in the body of a child who teaches him how to stand up for himself, all while forming an incredibly deep bond with the child. It's truly a beautiful story, and I I recommend the 2008 Swedish movie to anyone. But anyway, how do the queer themes enter into this story? Well, as the relationship between our two protagonists starts to turn more romantic, we see Ellie growing increasingly more uncomfortable with the label girl. And at one point, we even get this exchange between them.
Vill du bli ihop med mig? Oscar, jag är ingen flicka. Nej. Har jag chans på dig eller?
This has led many audiences to accept Ellie as non-binary, but the book that this movie is based on actually goes into a lot more detail. In the novel, Ellie reveals that they were born a boy named Elias roughly 200 years ago. But at the age of 12, they were kidnapped by a pedophilic nobleman who forcibly removed their genitals as well as turning them into a vampire so that they would be stuck in the body of a child forever. And for the past 200 years, Ellie has more or less been relying on pedophiles to take them in and take care of them, since their child body makes them weaker than most vampires. They've adopted a feminine name, dresses in feminine clothes, and they allow themselves to be perceived as a girl. But when Oscar asks about their gender identity, they state that they're not a boy or a girl. They say that they're nothing. Okay, let's unpack everything that's going on here briefly, because it is a lot. Ellie's transformation into trans woman reminds me very much of Angela's from Sleepaway Camp, in the sense that both girls are forced into femininity by an abusive adult. The only choice Ellie is allowed to make for roughly 200 years is which pedophile they're gonna allow to take them in. I don't know, I do understand why the writer John Lindvist would decide to go into this whole pedophile theme if they're dealing with a character that is literally an adult in a child's body, but at the same time, it just feels super awkward to just go there in the first place. Especially when you're using it in this context, you know? It's just extremely inappropriate to imply that your character is transgender because of childhood sexual abuse. But even going back to that very premise of Ellie being forced to live in a child's body forever, the very same act that made— Squirrel! My bracelets are loud. The very same act that made them trans in the first place also robbed them of all sexuality forever. When I look at Book Ellie, I don't see an actual transgender character. I see someone who's gone through so much psychological abuse that at this point they don't even have the freedom to identify themselves as anything. They're completely at the mercy of whoever just takes them in, until Oscar gives them their first opportunity to identify themselves in over 2 centuries. And when given that opportunity, they find that they just aren't capable of identifying themselves anymore. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad theme to explore, but I do think that that's a very complicated one. And if audience reactions to things like Psycho or Silence of the Lambs have taught me anything, it's that when you're talking about gender, it's best to keep things fairly easy to follow. Otherwise, people might start getting the wrong ideas, like say that Buffalo Bill is an actual representation of trans women.
It rubs the lotion on its skin or else it gets the hose again.
And that being said, I do think that the movie explores queerness in an infinitely superior way. The relationship between Ellie and Oscar remains sexless in the movie, but that's just because they're children. And the focus of the movie is supposed to be on the emotional bond between them anyway. When Oscar asks Ellie to go steady, even after they've already said that they're not a girl, it's because the two of them have developed an emotional bond that's much deeper than gender or sexuality. They could be a boy or a girl or a freaking vampire for all he cares. He just wants to keep them in his life because end of day, those things really don't matter. All that really matters is who's gonna be there to throw your bully's severed head into the pool when you really need a friend.
I need a real friend. Someone I can hold.
Number 10. May. Released in 2002, May is Lucky McKee's best film, Yes, Even Over the Woman, Don't At Me, and Angela Bettis's most amazing performance to date. In all honesty, this is the sort of movie that I feel like I discovered just a little bit too late in life. I was already 25 and had a smidgen of self-confidence by the time I first viewed this. But if I had watched this movie when I was 18 and at the full force of my self-loathing, you guys, I probably would have started a cult around this movie. The titular May is a shy and lonely bisexual girl who hasn't really gotten the opportunity to date anyone, as her lazy eye has more or less killed her self-esteem. When May receives contacts to correct her lazy eye, it gives her the confidence to start dating. First a boy who she quickly learns doesn't share her blood kink.
This is weird.
Hey, don't knock it till you try it, buddy. And then she tries a relationship with Anna Faris, only to discover that her new girlfriend doesn't plan on being as monogamous as she originally thought. I feel like this is the first time that a movie on this list has actually addressed a problem that's specific to the LGBT community, because I do remember running into this problem all the time back when I was dating. I think that there's this assumption that if you're attracted to more than one gender, then you must obviously want to be with more than one person. As much as it isn't okay to stifle another person's sexual liberty. And I am in full support of polyamory with the proper amount of communication behind it, of course. It can be very discouraging to think that you found a genuine connection with someone, only to find yourself wondering if they actually like you, or if they just like this idea of this sexually open partner that they've created in their head. I don't know, it's a tricky subject. The only thing I'm trying to say here is May's emotional arc is relatable. But then things just go completely off the rails, and I do want to make it clear that I stop relating to May at this point in the movie, but I never do stop feeling for her. I think the thing that makes May so strong is, more than anything, it's just such a human story. May is a bisexual woman, and her gender and sexual orientation isn't incidental, but the core emotion that she's experiencing, that loneliness, that's something that everyone knows in one way or another. As far as queer representation goes, this movie isn't perfect. I'm mostly uncomfortable with Anna Faris's character, as she's represented as the predatory lesbian up against the sweet and innocent May. In fact, their early interactions even verge on sexual harassment territory, which really isn't okay.
Do you like pussy? What? Cats?
But if you're able to look past a couple of cringy scenes, you'll find a disturbing little tale here that's definitely worth checking out.
Who taught you how to kiss?
Number 9. Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. Depending on how long you've been on this channel, you may or may not know that A Nightmare on Elm Street is one of my all-time favorite horror franchises. I discovered these movies for the first time when I was about 10 years old, and I sort of blame them for why I am the way that I am today. If the franchise is supposed to be all about nightmares, then this is the movie that feels the most like one. It can be surreal, and the things that are happening don't really make sense, but it's all about that metaphor, baby. And what is that metaphor, you might ask? Gay demons. The movie follows Jesse, a teenage boy who's just moved into Freddy's house and started having weird dreams. These dreams encourage him to do things like sleepwalk into a gay leather bar, pick up his coat, strip him naked in a shower, and then whip him to death. Honestly, I did the exact same thing in high school. Or break into his best friend's bedroom and beg to stay with him when he should be hooking up with his girlfriend right now.
Something is trying to get inside my body.
Yeah, and she's female and she's waiting for you in the cabana. And you want to sleep with me.
If it isn't clear, Nightmare on Elm Street 2 turns Freddy Krueger into a metaphor for Jesse's latent homosexuality. And the struggle of the movie revolves around Jesse's need to overcome these thoughts so that he can settle into a nice, normal, heterosexual relationship with a woman who looks exactly like Meryl Streep. It may also be worth noting that Jesse is played by Mark Patton, a gay actor who found himself typecasted after appearing in Nightmare on Elm Street 2 and who ultimately left acting altogether in 1999 after he was diagnosed with HIV. If you want to know more about the whole story, then I definitely recommend checking out the documentary Scream Queen, which I entirely blame for changing my opinion on this movie.
You know, the mainstream public, they weren't ready for a male scream queen. They couldn't articulate it.
All I'm going to say is by the end of the documentary, you're going to want to adopt Mark Patton so that you can protect him from any further harm. This is a cruel and heartless world, and this man definitely deserved better. As far as the movie itself goes, it's an absolute fever dream, but it is very interesting to see just how far we've come in 36 short years. This movie used to really mean something to audiences.
For a lot of us, Nightmare on Elm Street 2 was our introduction to a lot of gay in that movie.
And to some extent, I can understand why. Jesse is centered as the most queer character, and as much as his queerness itself is vilified, he isn't. And not to mention, his struggles with his sexuality may very well be affected by the context of HIV and AIDS. The 80s were a scary time to be gay. Homophobia was rampant, and repression, well, not ideal, may be tempting, especially when you're a teenage boy with old-fashioned parents. So I can understand why someone might love this movie if they were watching it back in 1985. But more than anything, I just find it very interesting how watching this movie under different contexts, it has different meanings. What could once be defended as a story about being gay in the time of AIDS is now viewed by modern audiences as a story about heteronormativity and repression. I do hope that we eventually get to a day where even a 10-year-old finds it just way too ridiculous to continue.
There's only one way to get rid of a temptation, and that's to yield to it. Resist it, and the soul grows sick with longing for the things it has forbidden to itself.
Number 8. The Picture of Dorian Gray. The Picture of Dorian Gray is a gothic novel that was written by Oscar Wilde in 1890, telling the story of a young man who wishes to maintain his youth and beauty indefinitely. So he sells his soul so that a portrait of himself will age in his place while he gets up to all sorts of ageless shenanigans. Now, when it comes to talking about Oscar Wilde, there tends to be two schools of thought. Either that the context of his death should matter, or that it shouldn't. And I don't really know where I land, but I'm gonna tell you the story anyway because I want to. Oscar Wilde was sort of the first celebrity. Although he was very well known for his plays, prose, and poems, he was more well known for his wit and personality, which made him a favorite to invite to pretty much any social event in the late 19th century. On February 18th, 1895, the Marquis of Queensberry left his calling card at a club that Oscar Wilde frequented, the Albemarle, which was inscribed "For Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite." The reason for this calling out was that the Marquis of Queensberry had recently discovered that his own son, Lord Alfred Douglas, had been having an affair with Oscar Wilde for some time. And although Wilde was actually having an affair with this man, he was humiliated by the public calling out, and many of his friends encouraged him to sue the Marquis of Queensberry for libel. This turned out to be a very bad idea, because as it turns out, the only way that the Marquis of Queensberry could then avoid a 2-year prison sentence was by proving that the accusation was true. So basically, imagine a very public trial of a celebrity, all with just the intention of proving that he's gay. It was eventually revealed that Oscar Wilde had ties to male prostitutes, many of whom were brought in and questioned before the court. And even the contents of his own writing were used against him, the Picture of Dorian Gray especially, although I'll get into why in a little bit. The trial left Oscar Wilde financially devastated, and after the Marquis of Queensberry was found not guilty, Wilde was arrested for sodomy and gross indecency. Wilde pled not guilty, arguing that he couldn't possibly be guilty, because the love between an older man and a younger boy is the purest kind of love there is. Okay, I was on your side until the age stuff. Anyway, Wilde's assertion of his innocence did nothing to help his case, and he was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor, which was the maximum sentence allowed, and even the judge himself admitted that it was an unusually harsh punishment. Wilde lived the last few years of his life in poverty and exile, before dying at the age of 46 from meningitis, his last words being, "This wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. Either it goes or I do." God damn it, Oski. You might have your cringy moments, but you do know how to construct a sentence. But anyway, let's go back to the picture of Dorian Gray for a little bit. Why was this book such an important figure during the trials? Well, to begin with, there is just the general amorality of the book. Well, Dorian is the central figure of the book. He's caught between two men who sort of serve as his shoulder angel and shoulder devil. The part of the shoulder devil is played by Lord Henry Wotton, who encourages Dorian to take full advantage of his youth and beauty while he still has it.
The gods have been good to you, Mr. Gray.
Why do you say that?
Because you have the most marvelous youth, and youth is the one thing worth having.
Something that Dorian does in spades after the whole soul-selling ordeal. At that point, Dorian enters into a world of having sex, and getting drunk, and collecting art. Which honestly doesn't sound that bad, but to the Victorians was just like the worst thing you could do. Now, to be fair, the book does go out of its way to state that the reason why Dorian's decadence becomes a problem is that it hurts people, especially the men and women who get involved with him and have their reputations ruined as a result. Many critics at the time were worried that the book would encourage people to live a more hedonistic lifestyle. But there were also those queer themes that people objected to. This theme was probably clearest through the character of Basil Hallward, Dorian's shoulder angel, who sees him as the epitome of purity and wants to keep him as such.
And now, Dorian, get up to the platform, and don't pay any attention to what Lord Henry says.
It is a little cringy because you can tell that Oscar Wilde was really going for that whole no love purer than an older man and younger boy thing, which is just like, can we not? But at the same time, Basil is the most genuinely supportive relationship that Dorian has. Being a Victorian Gothic novel, it should come as no surprise that it's been adapted into roughly about 1 million movies, none of which are all that much to write home about. But end of day, the reason why this story doesn't appear any higher on the list is because I don't feel quite satisfied with it yet. I feel like Oscar Wilde's story isn't quite finished. It ends abruptly with his death, but really, is that it? Can we really add no more? I don't know. As much as I didn't really have a definitive version to add to this list, I still didn't want to exclude this story because it is one of my favorite queer horror stories. And it's one that I will return to time and time again in the hopes of finally seeing the product that I always knew it could be.
That picture is my finest work, and it would be greatly appreciated.
Greatest gift that anyone could ever have given. Not sure that I've ever fully expressed my gratitude.
How far are you willing to go, Michael?
Number 7, The Lost Boys. Okay, this one is bending the rules just a little bit, as it doesn't include any openly queer characters, but I'd be too sad not to include it. Made by openly queer filmmaker Joel Schumacher, yes, the guy responsible for Bat Nipples, The Lost Boys follows new boy in town Michael, who's at first entranced by Star here, which I get it, man. Something about those skirts has me feeling a certain type of way too. But he then spends the rest of this movie completely entranced in whatever David, the leader of these stylish vampires, is doing. And then there's just the entire character of Sam, and this Rob Lowe poster on the wall, and yeah, don't tell me that this movie doesn't count.
Come with us, Michael.
Mom? Dad? What am I?
Number 6, the Child's Play franchise. Okay, so to start, it might be worth mentioning that Child's Play co-creator Don Mancini, who stuck through the franchise through thick or thin, is an openly gay man, so there's that. The queer themes don't really enter into the series until around Bride of Chucky, which, incidentally, is also around the time that Don Mancini began gaining more creative control. Bride of Chucky introduces a few new characters, the most important of them being Tiffany Valentine, Chucky's girlfriend, who's played by the flawless Jennifer Tilly. Seriously, I would commit murder for her. But although Jennifer Tilly is a cisgendered woman, Tiffany may as well be a drag queen character, with all of her overly exaggerated femininity. We'll get back to her in a little bit, but for now let's talk about David, who's the only openly queer character in the movie.
I think Warren's in love.
Yuck. Not my type. I'm so over that whole uniform thing.
He's sort of the gay best friend stereotype to the final girl, and because of that, he is sort of forgettable. But he also serves as the only voice of reason in the movie, before promptly being killed off with a truck to the face. Transgender actress Alexis Arquette is here, but as she's playing a male character, I don't really know what else to say about that.
Come on, Tiffany. Let's die a little.
I just love Alexis Arquette and thought I should mention her, that's all. Moving on to Seed of Chucky, we're introduced to the child of Chucky and Tiffany, the gender fluid Glenn and Glenda. Glenn and Glenda, by the way, are named after the 1953 Ed Wood film Glenn or Glenda.
Thus, the strange case of Glenn who was Glenda, one and the same person, not half man, half woman, but nevertheless, man and woman in the same body.
As far as the characters of Glenn and Glenda in Seed of Chucky, I feel like I've always wanted to like them more than I actually do, which is kind of how I feel about Seed of Chucky entirely. Like, Glenn is just this whiny little pacifist who encourages Tiffany to go on this no-fun journey of treating murder like an addiction.
Chucky, Glenda's right. It's time we owned up to it. We have a problem with killing.
And this is honestly the movie where Tiffany is just like at her most annoying, you guys, and it's all because of this little fuck right here. And Glenda's whole thing is being homicidal and manic, which could be a lot of fun if she actually got the screen time to develop that. Instead, the only thing that we really get from her is that she's the evil one. Ooh. And then the movie ends with Glenn and Glenda being split into two separate people, which never really made all that much sense to me. Like, I'm sorry, but if you siphoned half of my consciousness into two separate bodies, that wouldn't equate to one straight girl and one gay boy. Chances are you just get two barely functioning bodies stumbling around with half a consciousness, because gender fluid people are still complete people. Glenn and Glenda were written out of Cult of Chucky, so we go back to our only queer representation being these two superfluous characters who die early. That is, until Cult of Chucky, which revolves around final girl Nika, played by Chucky actor Brad Dourif's real-life daughter, Fiona Dourif, squaring off against Chucky one last time. At the end of the movie, Chucky actually succeeds in possessing Nika, and we get this little exchange between Chucky and Tiffany.
So this is different. I don't know. Works for me.
Tiffany is bisexual. The character that I have so desperately wanted to look up to as a queer icon ever since I was a tiny child is officially out as queer. I know I should probably unpack the potential trans narrative in Chucky possessing a female body, but I really don't want to because I don't see this as a queer moment for Chucky. I honestly think that Don Mancini just thought it would be cool to pass along the torch of Chucky. And who better to do that than Brad Dourif's own daughter? And it is really cool to see her embody the character that her father created. And she does it so well, just listen to that laugh. But I don't think that Chucky is inhabiting her body because he's been harboring a secret desire to transition these past 7 movies. Really, the only reason to bring up this scene at all is because I think it's kind of cool to see Tiffany confirmed bisexual, especially when she's been such a queer-coded character from her very introduction.
You look great, Tiff.
Where'd you come from? Number 5, The Haunting. Shirley Jackson's 1959 novel, The Haunting of Hill House, is one of those extremely special stories to me that I've read roughly 1,000,000 times. You might recognize it from one of its many adaptations. In both 1963 and 1999, it was adapted into movies that simply bear the title The Haunting, and the book was adapted again in 2008 for the Netflix series. But I'm gonna talk about the book first, honestly, just because it's the original. The book follows a group of people who have been invited out to a gothic mansion to investigate the existence of ghosts. I'm mostly going to be focusing on Theodora and Eleanor. Eleanor is the book's protagonist, and she's defined by a completely debilitating level of insecurity.
At last I'm going someplace where I am expected and where I am being given shelter, and I shall never have to come back.
As much as she knows the sort of person she wants to be, she lacks the courage to seek it out herself. Theodora, meanwhile, is the exact opposite. She's a confident, sexy artist who lives with a gender non-specific roommate and just sort of does what she wants. Between Shirley Jackson's apparent insistence to not reveal the gender of Theodora's roommate and this passage here, "What is your apartment like?" Theodora shrugged. "Nice," she said. "We found an old place and fixed it up ourselves. We both love doing over old things." "Are you married?" Eleanor asked. There was a little silence, and then Theodora laughed quickly and said, "No." Led many 1950s readers to believe that Theodora might be a lesbian or bisexual. But Shirley Jackson herself claimed that it was all just coinky-dink. But, you know, death of the author here for a minute. If we were to read Theodora's character as such, it would actually be an extremely powerful reading. Theodora is juxtaposed as Eleanor's foil. While Eleanor crumbles under the weight of her own insecurities, Theodora goes on to live a happy, beautiful, confident life. And not to mention, Eleanor looks up to Theodora. She views her as the ideal woman in some ways. So to present the ideal woman as a modern, artistic, sexually active queer woman, there is something extremely empowering about that. And even though Shirley Jackson has claimed that she never intended to write Theodora as a queer character, every single adaptation since has assumed she is. That being said, even though Theodora has been turned into a more directly queer character over time, I still don't know if I've ever been completely satisfied with it. In the 1963 film, which was produced under the Hays Code, and so couldn't be too upfront about the whole thing, it was mostly just hinted that Theodora might have a crush on Eleanor, which was supposed to add tension to the scenes where Eleanor turns to Theodora for comfort, which is just like so problematic to me. Your lesbian friends are not using your mental breakdown as an excuse to grope you. That's just something that this movie made up, don't worry. In the 1999 movie, Theodora is played by Catherine Zeta-Jones, and she does make mention of being bisexual.
Oh, you mean you have trouble with commitment?
Well, my boyfriend thinks so, my girlfriend doesn't.
But besides that, it's kind of hard to say what this movie is saying about, well, anything. This movie is a mess, you guys. She does seem to be idealized as this sexy character, but everything is just so surface level in this movie that it comes across as a lot more objectifying than anything. And then we have the Netflix series, which needs to add more drama and conflict in order to keep things interesting. And well-idealized characters like Theodora are fine in contained narratives like books or movies. The TV series needed to give her a couple more flaws in order to keep things interesting, which I do understand. It just comes at the sacrifice of her original role in the story. She was supposed to be this image of idealized womanhood that Eleanor felt she could never achieve. Not because she was sexy or attached to a man or highly acclaimed or anything, simply because she just had the confidence to live life her own way. And that message that this is the perfect woman, this confident, sexy, beautiful, happy woman, this is the image that we're achieving. That whole thing kind of goes away when you start giving her flaws and stuff. Honestly, I know that a lot of people really liked the Netflix show, and maybe I should give it more of a chance. I just have a really hard time with it because I really like the book, and every single time that I turn the show on, it's just so different from the book, and I just can't stop comparing it, and it's a me thing. This isn't a case like The Picture of Dorian Gray where I feel like I need more. Rather, I feel like it was handled pretty perfectly the first time. By a writer who didn't even know they were writing a queer character. Yeah.
You've been out of the world a long time, haven't you? But the world's missed you.
I'm not much of a man by the light of day, but by night I'm one hell of a lover.
Number 4, Rocky Horror Picture Show. Okay, I won't dwell on this one too long because what is there to say about Rocky Horror Picture Show that hasn't been said before? The songs are catchy, the costumes are fun. I do understand that the gender politics are getting to be a little bit outdated nowadays, but emotionally, I will never forget that first time that I saw Tim Curry strut out in heels and a corset, and suddenly, I knew what I wanted to be when I grew up.
I've come to answer your prayers.
Number 3, Interview with the Vampire. So if you were curious to know, this is my trash. I will say that the first Interview with the Vampire is legitimately good. Anne Rice wrote the novel after the tragic passing of her young daughter. And I'm always fascinated by stories like these that come from such a specific emotional period of time that's just so personal to the writer that nobody will ever be able to recreate it. Interview with the Vampire follows Louis, a young man spiraling into depression after the passing of his brother in the book and his wife and child in the movie. And in the midst of his rampant search for self-destruction, he stumbles across Lestat, a vampire who's drawn in by Louis's apparent need for death. Lestat turns Louis into a vampire, and the pair of them enter into a centuries-long abusive relationship. Highlights of which include Lestat emotionally manipulating Louis into staying with him by giving him a daughter, and said daughter eventually deciding to murder Lestat after she grows tired of being stuck a child forever. The thing that makes Interview with the Vampire interesting to me is its ability to tap into emotions at a very deep, core level. The first book is entirely about depression. The events of the story do matter, but only so far as they keep giving Louis a new side of depression to react to. And if that's true of Interview with the Vampire, then its sequel, The Vampire Lestat, is entirely about mania, because it switches perspectives from Louis to Lestat. Lestat is definitely a much more fun protagonist than Louis. He's much more impulsive, which allows for a more active plot. And the sequel does still maintain that sense of being about a singular, contained emotion more than anything. Like I said, at some moments it seems to be some sort of mania that Anne Rice is trying to explore. But I do have one glaring issue with The Vampire Lestat, and that's that it really tries to rewrite the past in kind of uncomfortable ways. For instance, Interview with the Vampire goes into great detail about Lestat's bloodlust. To quote directly from the book, Lestat killed humans all the time, sometimes 2 or 3 a night, sometimes more. He would drink from one just enough to satisfy a momentary thirst and then go on to another. The better the human, as he would say in his vulgar way, the more he liked it. A fresh young girl, that was his favorite food for the first of the evening. But the triumphant kill for Lestat was a young man. And this is the Lestat that the Vampire Lestat describes. How was he to know that I hunted almost exclusively among the gamblers, the thieves, and the killers, being more faithful to my unspoken vow to kill the evildoer than even I had hoped I would be? Lestat then goes on to discuss every single time that he killed someone in the first book in a cruel and sadistic manner, but he reveals that there was actually something that we didn't know at the time, like they were some sort of evil killer or something that justifies why it was okay. It's kind of obvious to me that this is just lazy writing on Anne Rice's part. At some point between the 2 books, she just decided that she wanted Lestat to be a more heroic character than he was, so she just threw in some details at random. But if you think about it from like a narrative perspective, it's kind of creepy because it makes one of our 2 protagonists extremely unreliable. Either Louis was intentionally lying about Lestat to publicly make him look like a worse person, which is incredibly toxic, or Lestat is intentionally misremembering past details in an attempt to gaslight Louis back into a relationship with him, which is also extremely toxic. Either way, I suppose this relationship was never meant to be healthy, which I think is part of the reason why you won't see it top very many queer favorite lists nowadays. I think most people would rather read about queer couples who aren't centered around antagonizing each other for centuries. And not to mention, the story is very problematic in other ways, like its weird normalization of slavery, which I do get that it was a different time, but still, there had to be a better way to do this. Did I mention that this series is trash? But I can't deny that there is something about this series' exploration of deep, heavy emotions that I can't resist.
But you must know something about the meaning of it all. Why? Why should I know these things? Do you know them?
I'm definitely nothing special. No, you are.
Number 2. Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Ugh, this is another one that I went back and forth on as far as included on this list because I feel like it hasn't really aged that well. But this is a list of my horror favorites, and justifying my favorites is turning out to be a lot more complicated than I thought it would be. When it comes to Buffy and queerness, I'm mostly referring to the characters of Willow and Tara, who were one of TV's first lesbian couples. Showrunner and now internet enemy Joss Whedon went back and forth between making Xander or Willow gay for the first 3 seasons, before finally outing Willow as a lesbian in season 4.
It's complicated. Because of Tara.
You mean Tara has a crush on us? No, you... Oh.
And I remember when I used to watch the show as a kid, people would always talk about how that was such good writing because it showed that he had a plan from minute 1, which sounds all well and good, but if you actually watch the first 3 seasons, you'll see that both Willow and Xander have long-lasting heterosexual relationships that do not at all feel forced or awkward. In fact, Willow's relationship with Oz is one of the most genuine on the show. And even when they break up, after Willow has already been outed as a lesbian, might I add, they have a conversation that makes it very clear that they still intend to have some sort of future together. They just don't feel like they fit in each other's lives right now.
I feel like some part of me will always be waiting for you. If I'm old and blue-haired and I turn the corner in Istanbul and there you are, I won't be surprised.
But now it's not that time.
So clearly, the intention wasn't for Willow to be a lesbian, right? Maybe bi or pan, but not a straight-out lesbian, right? They use the L word on multiple occasions on the show.
Well, let's put it this way. If I wasn't gay before, I think I'm kind of gay. Lesbian, gay type lovers.
A great big lesbo.
And I think I'm kind of gay.
It's really awkwardly handled too because Willow very clearly seems to be on a spectrum of sexuality depending on who's writing her. Some days she's straight.
I'm not constantly monitoring his health, his moods, his blood pressure.
130/80.
You got it bad, girl.
Some days she's dating Tara, but you know, still experiencing a bit of attraction to the boys.
Now I remember why I used to have such a crush on him.
Some days she's disgusted by men as a gender.
Love poems?
I'm over you now, sweetie.
But all days, she identifies as a great big lesbo. This is sort of like the Vampire Lestat, where I'm pretty sure that it's just lazy writing, but at the same time, the way that it comes across in the narrative just looks so bad. Because Tara makes repeated comments throughout the show about how she's kind of worried that Willow might eventually get bored of dating girls and, you know, stray for penis.
Yeah, this is a college thing, just a little experimentation before I get over the thrill and head back to Boys Town. You think that?
Should I?
Which is an actual discrimination that bisexual people face. So even though I am 100% sure that this isn't what the writers intended, it does kind of come across a little bit like Willow is bisexual, but she's just kind of forcing herself to identify as a lesbian to please her biphobic girlfriend, which is just awful. If you're ever faced with that in real life, please do not accept that. You should never have to shave off a whole part of your identity to please your partner. They should love you exactly as you are. And that isn't the only problem that Buffy has as far as representation goes. When I hear people talk about this couple nowadays, it's mostly to discuss the whole kill your gays trope.
You're sure?
But I can't deny that there was a period of time, especially in high school and college, that I watched every episode of this show religiously. And I can't deny that Willow and Tara were 2 characters that I gravitated towards. Separately, they were just such well-written characters. Both of them starting from very humble beginnings.
Well, maybe we could...
Yeah. Tara, guys, quiet. Do you have a suggestion?
Then coming into their own strength as the series went on.
You know, if you hadn't gotten so much of this in your system in the first place... Hey!
You're gonna back off.
There's this one episode in particular, Family, which focuses mostly on Tara's backstory of having to learn to accept herself as a lesbian witch despite coming from an incredibly unsupportive family.
Donnie and your dad having to do for themselves while you're down here living God knows what kind of lifestyle.
And it just gets me every time.
We are her blood kin. Who the hell are you?
We're family.
And not to mention, when the writers can resist being biphobic for a minute, Willow and Tara are a genuinely supportive and beautiful couple who really push each other to do better. And if it isn't clear from the other entries on this list, that isn't something that we see very often in the horror genre. These two have their problems, but I can't deny that I still appreciate seeing them.
Even when I'm at my worst, you always make me feel special. How do you do that?
Magic. Wow.
So you're a giant black cat, huh?
And the #1 queer horror favorite is Carmilla. Carmilla was first released as a gothic novel in 1872, roughly 25 years before Dracula. And if I'm being honest, I always felt that it deserved the respect that Dracula got. The novella follows Laura, your typical virginal, sheltered heroine, who begins having strange dreams after the arrival of their guest, the enchanting Carmilla, who has been feeding on peasant girls and Laura, the latter with the intention of turning her into a vampire herself, as the book makes it very clear that Carmilla's intention with Laura are, much more than friendly, we'll say. "I have been in love with no one, and never shall," she whispered, "unless it should be with you." How beautiful she looked in the moonlight. Shy and strange was the look with which she quickly hid her face in my neck and hair, with tumultuous sighs that seemed almost to sob, and pressed in mine a hand that trembled. Her soft cheek was glowing against mine. "Darling, darling," she murmured, "I live in you. And you would die for me. I love you so." I honestly think that part of the appeal of the story is just how simple it is. What do we have here? A lesbian vampire in love with a girl named Laura. That's it. Because of its simplicity, different writers have been able to play with the story over the years. Sometimes good, and sometimes really not good.
An evil fueled by a hatred of men and a love of women.
One adaptation of note would be the 1970 Hammer film production, The Vampire Lovers, where Carmilla is played by the gorgeous Ingrid Pitt. The movie only really has one problem, and it's the same problem that the book has. Carmilla dies at the end. I understand that she has to die due to the conventions of horror, but I mean, come on. Can't we just get one good thing? As a matter of fact, we can. Here on YouTube, the channel Kinda TV uploaded a web series that's sort of a modern day adaptation of Carmilla. And they even managed to turn it into a movie in 2017. It does feel a little bit like I'm watching an alternate universe fanfiction where all of the horror characters that I know are destined for tragic ends instead get to live out their happily ever afters. But I mean, hey, I guess we all need that every once in a while. And on that note, I think this list is long enough, so I'll leave you here. Thank you so much for joining me here today, my pets, and I will see you next time. Have a very happy Pride Month.
Get those nuts away from my face.
Although donating to my Patreon is unnecessary, it is hugely appreciated. As little as $3 a month could help me put out many more videos. On that note, I'd like to thank Wilson L. Ricks III, Scott Falks, Andre K, and Thrill House. Thank you so much for your support. It means the world to me. I can't wait to see you all next time.